The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Planning for the future is messy and rife with unknowns. Tonight, we revisit two conversations from earlier this year on finding productive ways forward. First, would adding so-called wealth taxes make the taxation system and Canada fairer? Then, Nan Kiwanuka talks to Canadian futurist Sinead Bovell about artificial intelligence and what lies ahead for young people and technology. It's Monday, June 12th, and that's next on The Agenda. This year's federal budget promised that Canada is, quote, raising taxes on the wealthiest 1% to cut taxes for the middle class. It also introduced some luxury taxes and pointed to action on so-called shell companies that better off people can use to shelter money. Are such moves enough to collect more and make a fairer tax system? Or is it, as some argue, time for a wealth tax in this country? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Tyler Meredith. He is co-founder of Meredith Bosencool Policy Advisors and a senior fellow at the Maitrey Foundation. And here in our studio, Alison Christians, professor of tax law at McGill University and the author of Tax Cooperation in an Unjust World. Birute Lukshanate is here. She's a lawyer and principal at Portfolio Estate Law. Anne Graham Moffat, senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And it's great to have you three here with us. You two, again, you in person for the first time?
Yeah, that's right.
You for the first time ever on the program
That's
at all.
right.
Beautiful. And Tyler, good to have you on the show again from the nation's capital. Paul Kershaw from Generation Squeeze, and he's going to get us off to a start here thinking about the question of what constitutes wealth. Sheldon, if you would.
We've done some polling recently where we were trying to probe Canadians' understanding of who's economically at risk, who's affluent. And we started with a scenario of, imagine a widow with an income of just $25,000, has her barely over the guaranteed income supplement living, so really close to low income. Rich or poor? Oh, that sounds poor. She lives in a home that she owns outright, and it's worth $1 million. People were not so sure now. Imagine the home's $2 million, which is not uncommon in the Toronto area or Hamilton area. And like, oh no, that person's rich. Then we swap it around and say, imagine a young lawyer making $200,000. It puts them in the top few percent of income earners in this country. Oh, definitely affluent. They're renting. And suddenly like, oh no, that person is less affluent than the widow with 25 grand who owns outright a home worth $2 million. I think we need to be recognizing that an older demographic might not view itself as Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, but the relative affluence and security that comes with secure housing is something that a younger demographic is feeling really crowded out of, and they're being jeopardized by it.
Paul will have more to say about this later in the program when he's coming up as a guest after this discussion. But he raises an interesting question of what constitutes wealth in this country, and therefore how do we design a tax system accordingly. All right. You've heard what he had to say.
Yeah.
How do you react?
Well, I think we always start with the fundamentals, right? You know, the tax system has to be fair in order for people to accept it and to cooperate with it. And so anytime there's a sense that things are not fair or they're getting less fair, I think people start saying, well, we need to fix it. And often people want to start by fixing it with something new, like a wealth tax, instead of fixing the system that we have. So, you know, I've said this before on the program, I think we often have to go back to the fundamentals and look at our income tax system the way that it works now and start thinking about what we could improve with the system we have before we start layering on top.
Tyler, what does that comment say to you about what constitutes wealth in this country?
Well, look, I think it is realistic for people to know that, wealth has actually improved quite a bit over the course of the last 15 years. People have actually gotten richer. And that's true in all groups for the most part, except the very poorest in our society. But the old adage, you're richer than you think, is actually true. And in fact, wealth inequality has actually improved even post-pandemic in the last 3 or 4 years, something that I think would be shocking to a lot of people. But I think this goes to a basic question of, do people feel like the economy is working for them? And a great example of that, so like Graham, I also teach at the University of Toronto. And students in my class, we were recently talking about tax issues. And when they talked about tax, they said to themselves, I don't feel like I'm going to get ahead. And I also don't feel like I'm going to get ahead because I don't know that I'm going to be able to buy a house. And so I don't know that that translates into we have to therefore change the tax system to address that problem. But we have to be able to show people that they are able to get ahead in society.
Okay, Birute, how do you react to what you just heard from Paul and the rest?
Well, I will tell you that I work with older clients who do estate planning work, and they are very dismayed at the already high level of taxation. And they feel that the wealth that they have accumulated throughout their lives is due to the very frugal lifestyle that they pursued that is not really comparable to the lifestyle of the current younger generations that may not be able to afford to buy a home, for example. And also have observed that when younger people inherit an estate, they are not necessarily very enthusiastic about saving that house of the family or buying a house with inherited assets. Rather, they would like to invest that money in something that brings enjoyment on a daily basis, or perhaps luxury purchases.
So the frugality of the previous generation may not be echoed in this generation.
That is my observation.
That is, okay. Graham, how do you react?
So, to go a little further on Paul's point, there's a question of intergenerational fairness here. About an incredible amount of wealth generated by especially the housing market in Canada, and people really struggling to feel like they're able to build that kind of nest egg in a younger generation. Now, I'm sure many of Birute's clients are slightly older than the baby boomer generation, but I don't think we would call the baby boomer generation particularly frugal in historical terms. We do have a problem of how we're going to pay for all of the social services that we have come to take for granted and that we appreciate as a society. And how we're going to pay for those is really the major question in intergenerational fairness with taxation. Whether we're going to tax the incomes of workers in the future and increase those taxes, or whether we can find a way to have the oldest and wealthiest members of our society pay a greater share of the services they're consuming, which tend to increase as they age because the cost of healthcare as you age increases.
For sure. Alison, do you think, given I think one of the things that emerges from Paul's comment is that it is a little trickier to figure out who's wealthy in this country and who isn't. Having said that, do we need a wealth tax in this country in order to pay for all the things that everybody says they want?
Right. So, okay, everybody thinks everybody else is wealthy and they are themselves not wealthy. Right. And everybody always thinks I'm paying a very high amount of tax and I don't want to pay more tax. So we have to start from that proposition that I think people don't actually know where they stand. And I think it's correct to say it's hard to determine whether this person is more wealthy than that person unless you take as a principle of the tax system that we should be taxing on the basis of ability to pay. And that's embedded in the income tax.
Yeah, we do that already.
Yeah, we do that. And so we think about wealth tax. When you say wealth tax, I say, okay, I'm not opposed to a wealth tax, but what do you mean? Like, what are we going to tax? So when you say wealth tax, you mean, would you like to tax the value of everyone's home every year? Well, the property taxes already do that, right? So are you adding on top of that? And is that means tested? Is there an ability to pay component to that? I think that you have to start asking those hard questions. And, it's just much easier to say, oh, you just need a wealth tax and let's just get more out of, some obscure, abstract pool of people that most definitely does not include me. I don't want to pay more tax.
So the devil is definitely in the details, and the details are tricky here.
They're always tricky, and they're always based on that fundamental question of when you start talking about what is fair, you have to interrogate that question. You can't just assume we know what is fair.
What's your reaction to a wealth tax?
Well, I recently read a study that looked at the history of the wealth tax in Europe. So currently, there are still 4 countries in Europe that levy the wealth tax. 3 of them on the global assets of a resident, which are in Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. And in Norway and Switzerland, these taxes have been levied since the 19th century. Now, in 1996, there were actually 12 countries that levied this tax. And they repealed this tax because it did not deliver the economic results and the tax objectives of the countries.
It didn't bring in the money they expected.
So it brings in a very small fraction of the budget of those countries, and it actually encourages to immigration, capital flight, very difficult assessment processes, because if you levied this tax in its purest form, you would have to value the value of the assets. They would have to be levied on the global estate of a person. So where assets are located in other countries, you would have to tax those assets as well. But how do you properly assess the value?
So,
do you require an annual evaluation?
Too complicated then.
It's very complicated. It may be a good idea, but it definitely needs further assessment.
Tyler, how about you? You for a wealth tax?
No, at least not in the form that is described often by, say, Senator Warren, and not because it's not pointing at an important problem, which is that wealth has gone up significantly, particularly in the top income and wealth categories over time, notwithstanding what happened in the pandemic. But just because I just think it's a huge waste of time. It's going to take 5 years to build the administrative capacities to be able to measure and tax those things. And it's very easy to move money around. I mean, a lot of liquid asset is just cash, or it's even illiquid assets, which is very hard to measure. And so why would we spend all of this time and effort to try to go after a very particular form of inequality in our society when there are other simpler backdoor ways to go at the same issue, which could be either changing how we look at income or even just better enforcing the rules that we have. We actually lose a fair bit of tax just by simply having so many loopholes in our tax system.
We'll look through the back door a little later in our discussion here, but Graham, I mean, that is part of the problem here, right? A wealth tax sounds like a neat idea, a neat populist, easy to get money idea, but the devil in the details is so tricky and it would take a long time to figure
there's
out.
a big, huge chasm between rhetoric and reality, and the political rhetoric and the reality of imposing a wealth tax. I think we're all in agreement that a wealth tax is impractical, at least on this panel. Everyone who's looked at it, most tax policy experts who've looked at this will say, okay, well, most countries are abandoning their wealth taxes. We have fewer countries with wealth taxes now than we did 10 years ago and 10 years before that. The practical realities of implementing a wealth tax, measuring everyone's assets, and forcing, basically asking everyone what they own all of the time, and to have the government have that information is not something everyone's comfortable with. There are ways of doing this, though, that are much more practical and don't impose the kinds of undue burdens on people who may have, relatively high wealth, like a $2 million home, and a relatively modest income. And that is that when someone's estate is transferred, when they die, and their estate passes to a relative or to, someone else, they do have to assess and measure all of those assets. So we do give a value to the estate. And at that point, it can be taxed. Those are inheritance taxes. Canada stands out in the OECD as for not having an inheritance tax. Most countries have an inheritance tax. In most countries in the OECD, it brings in about 0.5% of total taxes. And in places like Japan and Korea, it brings in about 1.5% of overall taxes.
Do you like that as an idea?
It's certainly a better idea than a wealth tax. I think it's probably less painful to pay a tax when you're dead than when you're alive.
Okay. Yes. Tyler, what do you think of the inheritance tax idea?
Well, we do actually have elements of an inheritance tax already, right? Because we have this rule called deemed disposition in the tax system. What deemed disposition in the tax system means is that when you die, if you have assets that are held in, let's say, stocks and bonds or ETFs, they will automatically be deemed as being sold to, through the estate. And so capital gains, if it's not in a tax-sheltered account, will have to be paid at that point in time. And income will have to be paid as though it has been proceeds to the estate. So we already already kind of have some version of an estate tax. It's just making sure that you pay tax at the time that the income comes out. The issue that what we don't capture is there are some elements of things that just transfer, right? That aren't included in what we would consider to be taxable. And there, I think there's a question of should they be in or should they be out. There are ways you could actually, if you wanted to expand an estate tax, I mean, you could basically use the existing system of probate fees as a way to potentially broaden that out into a version of an estate tax that wouldn't have the burden of complexity of introducing a whole new system as we would if we had to introduce a wealth tax.
What about you, Alison? Inheritance or estate taxes? Better way to go?
Yeah. So we have, when you die, it's like you sold everything for tax purposes. So I don't agree that we don't have an inheritance tax. We do. We have an estate tax in that sense. I think the key is that you can do intervals, you can do transfers during your lifetime, you can do planning during your lifetime to minimize your taxes. And I think most Canadians probably don't understand exactly the extent to which people who have means are able to plan their way out of paying taxes. And again, I think that feeds into this narrative, right? That, well, we need more taxes from the wealthy. Well, are we getting taxes from the wealthy? Like, how are we getting taxes from the wealthy? And if there's a chasm, the chasm is that, well, we have actually made a lot of exceptions in the income tax for capital, right? So your TFSA, your RRSP, your pension, all of these things are not going to be taxing capital. And so as the income tax focuses less on capital, it focuses more on employment and other kinds of income. And I think people who are on a fixed budget, but they have capital, and we think capital is not being taxed, then it's just creating that sense that there's just an unfairness. And why can't we fix that? There's lots of reasons that we might not be able to fix that. And I would say it starts with the politics rather than the policy.
Okay, before you get there, let's do a real estate follow-up here. Would a 1% tax on capital gains on point of sale of principal residences be a fair way to get more money out of the public?
Yeah, so actually, this is a great area where we do need to have a fix. Okay, so right now, if you sell your principal residence, your home, no matter how much you make, you're not going to have any tax. And this is unusual. In the U.S., there's an exemption up to $250,000 of gain per person. You know, why are we not thinking about ability to pay in that scenario? So, of course, for most people, there should be, there's a sense that we should protect the family home. We should protect the home is mostly where you live. It's not your investment, but it is for many people their primary investment. So maybe a 1% tax. I'm not sure. That's not really how I would do it personally. I would say you have an exempt amount, and above the exempt amount, that is capital gain that should be included in income. That would be in line with the United States and other countries. And I think then you would start at least to build into the income tax system, reinserting some excessive amounts of capital, and then maybe smoothing that out. But I always start from this place that it has to depend on ability to pay. You can't just throw taxes at everybody and say, we're just going to throw a percent at everyone and that's going to be fair. It's not necessarily going to be fair. People have different abilities to pay, and we do have different policy objectives always.
How do you like that idea?
I don't like the idea. I think that selling one's home already leads to large outlays. So, for example, you have to pay your real estate agent up to 5%. Then if you use that money to buy a new home, you pay land transfer tax. And then if you have 1% less of your original home proceeds, then maybe you're not able to afford a new home. I don't like this idea.
Okay, having said, I'm going to let you get back at that because you probably deserve a chance.
She doesn't like your idea. It's not my idea. She doesn't like it.
I think, can we bring this up now, Sheldon? Page 4, this graph. I mean, one of the reasons that governments are, I guess, considering the possibility of trying to do taxes related to real estate is look what's happened to wealth in this country, you know, over the last 50 years or so, 45 years. And for those listening on podcast, we've got a graph up here. Net wealth in housing in Canada, your principal residence in 1977, didn't matter if you were under 45 or over 55, you know, the amount of wealth you had in your home was basically about the same. If you go to present day, 58% of those over 55 have got like lots of real estate money, right? Whereas those under 45, it's only 21%. So that's an issue. So what do we do about that?
Well, I go back to my original comment that I think it's the lifestyles of the younger generations that
They're going to love that
perhaps,
comment. They're going to love that.
them to, and of course, real estate. But why is real estate so expensive? That's another question. Why do we have $3 million homes, and then what's the other option? You know, a $1 million condo. Why isn't there anything in between to allow people to be able to afford something
That's a different
more
show.
affordable?
That's a different show.
I think this is not a straightforward
Okay.
answer.
Okay, Graham, it isn't, it isn't. What do you mean?
So part of the reason why we have homes that are $2 and $3 million is because that's a tax-exempt investment.
Right.
Right? So if you set the tax code up such that there are certain categories of capital investments that are tax-exempt and others that are not, the money's going to flow toward the ones that are tax-exempt. Especially on disposition. And in that case in Canada, that's principally homes, principal residences. So what we're seeing is people willing to overinvest and overspend on homes because they know that they're going to get the money out without any tax. They know that home prices are going to go up over the long term, they always have, and they're going to get a profit without paying any tax on it.
So those conditions distort the situation somewhat.
So they do distort the prices of homes, of course. If we change the tax system, as you've suggested, whether it's through an estate tax or a property tax on the sale of principal residences, you're going to see a shift in the amount of money pouring into the residential real estate sector.
Got it. Tyler, where are you on all this?
Well, look, so I go back to what did my students at the University of Toronto tell me, right? They want more affordable housing. And I don't see how putting a tax on principal residences is going to make more affordable housing. The reason that we don't have affordable housing is because we're not building enough of it. We need to build more of it. And so if you had a plan that said, we're actually going to be able to build the 1.5 million homes that Doug Ford says we need to build, which we're not on anywhere close to being on track to building. But if we actually had a plan of how to build 1.5 million homes and that required some amount of public subsidization to do it, then I would say, well, how are we going to finance that? Are we going to finance that by looking at other creative ways to tax, let's say, investment properties, for example? That might be something that we should be interested to look at. But if we're talking about principal residence exemption, I mean, the problem in our real estate sector, I would argue, has not been created by people getting shelter, by people wanting to have their own home. It's been because we're not building enough homes and because they're competing with investors in the market. So we got to solve those problems. And tax can be part of that solution, but I don't think you're going to solve the problem on the principal home by making the principal home more expensive.
Sheldon, can I get this graphic up, top of page 2? Alan Lanthier from the Financial Post, who recently wrote, not that recently actually, but who wrote a few years ago. A recent report in Canadian Business estimated that Canada's 25 wealthiest families have a net worth of close to $200 billion, an average of $8 billion per family. Meanwhile, 15% of lower income Canadian families have a net worth of less than $500. So, to help address this gap, should we be asking Canada's wealthiest to pay more taxes? In addition to numerous annual taxes and levies, they already face capital gains tax on death. But what if taxation on death can be avoided? Okay, Birute, start us off on that. Can taxation on death be avoided?
So Canada has a unique rule that where a taxpayer dies, there's a deemed disposition of all their wealth. Well, capital assets primarily, which was mentioned already. And this includes not only their Canadian assets, but also their assets abroad. And Canada is a country of immigrants. And I have so many clients who have real estate in other countries, and they don't realize that if they pass away, even that foreign real estate will be subject to the Canadian capital gains tax. Now, there are exemptions, if they can be called exemptions. That's a rollover to a spouse or a spousal trust. So that's the only time when a deemed disposition on death does not result in tax. In all other cases, yes, tax applies to that wealth. Now, can it be avoided? Well, if you structure your assets during your life in a way that you don't own that wealth at the date of death, then your tax is minimized.
And that's legal tax avoidance.
Well, it is a tax planning, certainly.
Tax planning, okay.
And at best, it's tax deferral. There is no such thing as complete tax avoidance.
Okay. Tyler, in terms of the appropriateness of tax planning and tax avoidance, how does this sound to you?
So this is an area that actually requires a lot more study and analysis, because there are huge issues here, and it's very, and Alan and I, it's funny, Alan and I have disagreed on many things, but he points at a really important issue in that piece, and that is that we allow very creative tax structures and very creative tax planning to be able to avoid taxes, and on a certain level that is legal and appropriate, but it's whether or not you are entering into sophisticated planning that the average person, in absence of having access to those professional resources, would be able to do themselves. And this is actually where there's been a lot of effort, both by the federal government in the last couple of years, but also by a lot of governments around the world, to try to create stronger rules to anticipate these structures and to basically say that they're offside from the beginning. Now, whether that would capture this kind of situation that Alan has laid out, not sure. But the point being, we could actually generate a far greater share of public revenue just by simply better implementing the spirit of the Income Tax Act on its own.
Graham, let me follow up with you in this regard. We're not talking about tax evasion here, which is illegal. We're talking about legal tax avoidance, trying to legally pay as little as possible. This is a great cottage industry in Canada. Should we be discouraging this in order to have more money come into the Treasury to pay for the things, the services that Canadians want?
Well, it gets at an important point, which is that we can impose very complex new tax structures, and we can bring into being new tax laws. We can try to do things like wealth taxes. But probably the easier way to bring in more revenue to pay for the services we want is to enforce the laws that we have on the books better. So, for example, CRA invested fairly heavily in the last few years in enforcement, and that appears to have paid, at least anecdotally, appears to have paid huge dividends in terms of the amount of tax being brought in.
It always does. Yeah. Every Minister of Finance I've ever interviewed, if they send a few more auditors out there, they always get more money coming in.
Yeah, so that's probably step one. And then step two would be closing loopholes, like some of the ones that are used, some of the more egregious ones used in tax planning. So rather than creating new kinds of structures like wealth taxes or complex new inheritance taxes, just doing things like closing loopholes, like, for example, I think, what's it called, estate freezes, which Barute could probably speak to. Ways of transferring wealth between generations without having it seen by and taxed by the state in the way that ordinary people do. These are the kinds of things that you do if you're worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, that really is not accessible to ordinary people. And we have to ask whether that's fair and whether we should close those loopholes.
Is that fair, and should we close those loopholes? He said I had to ask.
Right. Well, let's look at it. So what is an estate freeze? So an estate freeze is a structure that allows to transfer the future growth on your wealth to be earned by other individuals, so your family members, for example, or perhaps your employees. If you're an incorporated business, you can give shares of that will hold the future growth in your company to your employees. Now, who uses estate freezes? So estate freezes are often utilized by small businesses who want to allow their families to retain that small business in the family. Now, if you prevented estate freezes from being available, those families may not be able to continue the business within the family after the original founder of the business passes away. Only 40% of all small businesses in Canada actually are continued by the next generation. That's a fairly small percentage, I would say. Well, relatively small percentage. And then that percentage decreases to when we look at further generations. Now, if that family had to find the cash to pay tax on the death of their father, for example, when that value became taxable on death, that problem of continuing the business would be so much greater, because not only would they have to want to continue the business, but they would also have to find the money to be able to continue the business. So I think that estate freezes are actually still a very good option.
You don't mind you mind if I seek a second opinion on this?
Absolutely.
Allison, what's your view?
Well, look, I don't think that it's possible to think about tax without thinking about when the law says that this is taxable, then the taxpayer is going to say, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else so I don't face the tax. So this is an inherent problem with building a tax system. You're going to write a rule, and then most people are going to follow the rule. And they will follow the rule if they think the rule is going to be enforced against them, and if they, generally speaking, people sort of voluntarily cooperate with the tax system. Now, the more sophisticated your plan gets, the more possible some people are going to not have to follow the rule. They'll go around that rule. That's not something you can stop. The taxpayer is going to try not to pay the tax. So the question is this egregious? So on the scale of egregious from estate freeze to, sort of Loblaws as a bank, I think, there's a big gulf here. And I think there's an obscurity gulf as well. And that's the one that worries me.
What does that mean?
Well, so your average taxpayer does not understand what an estate freeze is. So it sounds bad and it sounds scary and it sounds like, oh, that sounds like tax avoidance. We really should shut that down. But then if you start digging into the details and looking at it, they might say, oh, okay, well, maybe there are reasons that we haven't shut that down. This is not a new strategy. This is not something they came up with last year. But how many taxpayers are watching the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court has to decide whether some convoluted scheme that some giant company has cooked up for years, with a bunch of lawyers, how many taxpayers are watching that and saying, oh, wait a minute, I don't like that is the outcome here. I don't like that there are all these other things that I don't understand in the tax system. And so this obscurity gap, makes my job really hard, right? Because I don't want to defend an estate freeze. I don't care about the estate freeze. But I do think that there are very structural problems in the Income Tax Act. And some of those, if I started telling you about them, you would just yawn. You would say, I don't care about interest deductibility. And
I would never yawn when you talk.
After a while, you might.
But one of the things that emerges from this conversation is that it doesn't sound like whatever new thing you want to do is going to be problem-free. Everything you want to do is going to create some other problem. So, Tyler, what should we do?
Well, actually, just to pick up on Allison's point, because I think there's a really important thing there. One of the most important things that I think has happened in the tax system in the last number of years, it just happened in this budget, in the last federal budget. It's called the modernization of the general anti-avoidance rule. And this is super important because it gets at the issue that Allison just raised, which is it used to be you had to basically, if CRA found something that was inappropriate, that was excessive tax avoidance and aggressive tax planning, it had to go to the court and basically prove that was the intent, that there was an obvious attempt to try to flout the spirit of the Income Tax Act. Now, under the proposed modernized general anti-avoidance rule, we would say you have to prove that there is a valid economic substance to this transaction that you want to do, and that the tax value of that doesn't outweigh all of the other attributes that you're proposing to get. And that's important because it actually it puts the burden of proof of the fairness of the tax system on those who are actually trying to use it for tax planning purposes. That is one of the most important things that we could do.
Graham, what would you do?
I think that so Tyler's raises an important point. That's a fundamental change to the tax system, and I think it's a major contribution. If we look at what this government has managed to do over the last 8 or 9 years, I guess it's 8 years that they've been in power, there have been some minor changes to the way that they structure taxes, but by and large they've left the tax system alone. They haven't done any major structural reforms to it. And I think that's probably the best we can hope for with the kinds of federal governments that we get these days, which are often minority governments. They don't have a lot of political capital to spend on major reforms to the tax system. So incremental steps, closing loopholes, these kinds of fixes are. We already have a very progressive income tax system. And the question is, what are we going to do to pay for these, the expansion of services and the reduction in the ratio of workers to retirees in the future? And it's going to be incremental steps, I think, is the best we can hope for.
Anybody suggesting the government should just spend less, therefore it doesn't need to tax more? No, okay. Can I just, in our last seconds here?
Well, that's the French side.
Well, we're bilingual on this place here. Okay, yes. Alison Christian's brought this in. She does love tax law.
I do.
And we love having her on this program. Mr. Director, can I get a shot of everybody here? So I can thank everyone for coming into TVO tonight, and Tyler, in you, in the nation's capital as well, and joining our little love fest about tax law here on the agenda tonight. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
While many of us recently flocked to try out a new artificial intelligence app, some people paused to ask, where does this go now? A Canadian futurist who is founder and CEO of the tech education company Way has put a lot of thought into what's ahead. Her name is Sinead Bovell. She's on the United Nations Generation Connect Visionaries Board and a contributor to Wired magazine. And Sinead Bovell joins us now. Hi.
Hello.
It's such a pleasure to meet you in person. I've been following you on all the social media, so it's nice to see you in person.
You too, you as well.
So you're a futurist. What does that mean?
I think the name sounds a lot more glamorous and mysterious than it is, but essentially tracking a lot of data points, both qualitative and quantitative, and using it to build forecasts and future scenarios. So tracking things from emerging technologies to patents to who's a company hiring, and using that to kind of make forecasts about where we could be headed.
So you mentioned forecasts, not predictions.
Absolutely not predictions. That's an entirely different wheelhouse.
So we seem to be living in what media is always saying, we're living in unprecedented times. And a lot of people, I think, are feeling maybe less optimistic than they have in the last little while. As a futurist, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Right. So I think if we even just look at the trajectory of history, we have been improving in a lot of key metrics for humanity over time. But when we look out into the future, a lot of the problems that we face today, we have solutions for. It's just about humans making the right decisions and steering our future in the right direction. But I think a lot of the key critical problems that we're facing today, we can solve them. We just have to make the choice to do so. And so that's what keeps me quite optimistic, and knowing that the optimistic scenarios are very much possible.
I have two small kids, and over at the beginning of the pandemic, they were online, and then before that, pediatrician said no screens, no tech. And now it seems to be this little like push and pull. We relied so much on technology during the pandemic for many different things, but then now it's like, oh no, we can't. So do you think that we know? Do you think that we know enough to make the decisions that we need to make forward, or do we just need more education around it?
I think a lot more education around it, and I think for starters, a lot of our vision of what technology is devices, but technology is things like software as well, so artificial intelligence. So tech education really needs to include those types of concepts for children as well, so they're prepared. And it's not just a matter of, do we use iPads or do we not? Should an AI be making this decision about us? Or if an algorithm put this piece of information in front of us, can I think critically to know why it did that? Those are the types of areas of tech education that I think are important, and I don't think we do enough of that.
Well, you did a TED Talk earlier this year, or last year in 2022, and you shared this TED Talk about digital avatars.
Right.
And I'm just going to tell the audience, just prepare to have your mind blown. We're going to show a clip of it.
This is Shudu Graham. She's a striking South African model, likely on the path to supermodel. Scroll through her Instagram, you can see all of the big campaigns she's landed. She's been featured in Vogue a few times, which is kind of like the Holy Grail. And she's also an activist. She uses her platform as a rising Black supermodel to call for more diversity in fashion. And I think that's incredibly admirable. There's another fact about Shudu. She isn't real.
Okay, what?
Yeah, so Shudu is part of an emerging field of digitally generated people, so digital avatars. She isn't powered by AI, she's a digital construction, but she books campaigns. She's been featured in Vogue quite a few times, and avatars and AI as digital humans will play a role in our future. Fashion modeling, spokespeople, news anchors, we'll start to see them kind of creep into more and more industries.
You said news anchors and I started getting a little hot under the collar.
I mean, every industry is going to have to prepare for the future of work. And I think it seems a little bit shocking to see an AI or an avatar in the world of fashion modeling, because we previously believed jobs that were more in creative industries were immune to technology. But I don't think any lane really is.
Okay, but let's unpack this a little bit, because in the world of fashion, and you've been a model before, in the world of fashion, there aren't that many women of color in modeling, and there are very few women who are dark skinned. So she's booking campaigns, which means that she's making money. First, who's behind Shudu, and what other, I guess, complications does this create?
Right. So the person who created and who controls Shudu is white and male, which means the future is heading in a direction where people can create and control identities outside of their own ethnic groups. This doesn't inherently have to be a bad thing, but it does provide a lot of opportunity for exploitation. So in the case of Shudu, you mentioned profit, for example. Shudu represents a real Black fashion model, but the income her identity generates isn't going to Black women. It's going to her creator, a white man. So we are financially shutting out Black women from these opportunities while their identity is still being profited off of. And for me, this raises quite a few red flags.
What other red flags does it raise for you?
So there's the idea of, one, being misrepresentation. Shudu is designed through the lens of a white man's vision. So her skin tone, hairstyles, all of that, it's through his version of what he finds desirable. So there's a lot of opportunity for stereotyping, appropriating, and misrepresentation, which marginalizes real Black women. And if you look at this kind of as a lens to the future, you could see it playing out as a loophole for companies, right? So instead of having to invest in diversity or improve company culture, a company could just hire or create avatars instead from different ethnicities and kind of manipulate the relationship those groups may have with that company. So those kind of raise some red flags to me. And I think the final one is that we have to remember access to the market that creates avatars like Shudu, and especially more advanced ones that will be powered by AI. It's not equal. There are certain structural challenges that make it harder for some communities to access resources, the time, skill, the capital to build these types of avatars. So we're more likely to see some dominant cultures be the creators and owners and controllers, again, further marginalizing already marginalized communities.
AI has been around for a while now. Why do you think we're more concerned about it now?
I think we are waking up we interface with it a lot more. I mean, social media has been a platform to kind of get these stories out a little bit faster. But I think it's an intersection of us all just waking up to technology, whether it's how our data is being used, what are the main companies that are kind of steering our future. We're starting to tune into that, and I think it's a really good thing.
Well, we've been hearing a lot about ChatGPT, and Google has its own AI chatbot called Bard, and shares recently in Alphabet, Google's parent company, sank more than 7%, knocking $100 billion off the firm's market value when it answered a question incorrectly that was posted in an advert on Twitter. But it still seems like an uncertain time for chatbots. What's your take?
I think chatbots are going to be the future of how we largely interface with the internet and with technology. I think that they will play quite a dominant role. When it comes to Google versus ChatGPT or OpenAI or Microsoft, I think that competition is good for us and for consumers. It forces companies to innovate and bring better products to
more accountable, maybe?
Market. Yes, what does concern me with chatbots is that they aren't actually intelligent, right? They don't know what they're saying, and they sound incredibly scholarly, but it could be complete nonsense. And when you have companies then competing for a first place or to kind of be the first mover, it can get sloppy. And AI is a serious technology. It's not a joke to kind of mess around with. And so in this instance, where Google's chatbot Bard said something, incorrect, if it had a lot more significance, if somebody was using that piece of information to make a critical decision with, then that's not so great and it's not so inconsequential.
You mentioned earlier about the displacement of jobs. I just wanted to go through some information here for a second, and then we're going to talk about that. The World Economic Forum released a report in 2020 saying that COVID shifted the way we work. The report concluded that the workforce is automating faster than expected, and that 85 million jobs will be displaced by 2025, which is now 2 years away. The robot revolution will create 97 million new jobs, but communities most at risk from disruption will need support from businesses and governments. Analytical thinking, creativity, and flexibility among the top skills needed. Data and artificial intelligence, content creation, and cloud computing will be the top emerging professions. And the most competitive businesses will be those that reskill and upskill current employees. Is there a risk that this move towards automation won't create jobs more equitably?
Absolutely. I think that the fact or the point about it creating more jobs is correct. I think if we look at historical trend lines, technology has net led to more industries, new avenues. But how those jobs get created, who has access to them, and who is given the resources, time, and skills to pivot towards them, that can absolutely be a problem in terms of equity. And if we look in even the last 10 years, how income has kind of been divided, it isn't trending in a direction that's favorable or equal. And I do think that that's something that we need to be tuning into.
Do you think, though, that maybe in some ways we're kind of just it's going to happen eventually, right? So should we not adjust to this very real probability?
Yeah, I think the technology isn't going away. Our future workforce will be more augmented by it than less. So we do need to lean into it and try to minimize the potential gaps. I think if there's anything we can learn from the Industrial Revolution is that you have to take care of your society and your citizens, because that's where the real problem lies, when people are left kind of to fend for themselves economically, their purpose and otherwise. I think the numbers are in. We know which direction we're headed towards. We have an opportunity to prepare people as best we can, and I think it's really important that we take that.
AI goes beyond a chatbot. Now there are tools out there that can mimic someone's voice and create images that kind of there's been times when I'm like, is this real? Is this not real? There was a recent video of Steph Curry just hitting the net, like getting the basket from all over the court, and I thought it was real. It was not real. What are the concerns around that?
Around authenticity and transparency.
And even just maybe the deep fakes that we're seeing.
Right, I think deep fakes present quite a critical geopolitical threat that we don't really have a solution for at this point. And the truth about deep fakes is it's not just that we are at risk of believing what's not true, but that we stop believing what is true. We become so disoriented in a sea of all this information that we lack a critical discourse and direction. And I think that that's a real risk. And we have already started to see in some geopolitical situations deep fakes being used, but we were able to kind of detect that. There have been companies that have had systems, or Microsoft has been a big player in kind of flagging that. But it's very much a cat-mouse scenario. We don't have an actual plan. And so I do think deepfakes present quite an emerging threat, and that should be part of the tech education curriculum and discussion points. How do we spot these? How do we know to even look for them in the first place?
What about voice mimicking?
That as well. I would kind of put that, so there's deepfake audio, deepfake visual. I would kind of lump that all in together. And the technology is just further advancing. So you had mentioned GPT. There are similar technologies where you can take a 3-second clip of somebody's voice and use it to generate an entire podcast that they never were featured on. And so on the one hand, it's going to be great for creators and all of these new tools and resources. But on another end, it's the disinformation and misinformation can be produced at a fraction of the cost and at a fraction of the speed. And that, I think, is quite an emerging threat that we need to tune into.
That's very nerve-wracking. Did you recently, when you were talking about, we're talking about the mimicking of the voices, but when we talk about art, art comes from a place of experience and emotion and someone's perspective. But recently there was this, I guess, not controversy, but more conversation about this one app that could create images of all of us that were just stunning. What are your thoughts about that? Like the AI in this space is kind of in art and creating works of poetry and literature.
So I think there's definitely been a lot more hesitance or kind of pushback on AI stepping into these creative realms. And for many reasons, I think up until this point, we thought creativity was something that's uniquely human. And to see it be synthesized by an AI system, it's very alarming because it changes how we relate to ourselves as humans, right? Poetry, art, music, those are things that we think only some humans are even naturally endowed with. And to see it get passed to a machine seems very jarring. But I think every single industry is going to be impacted by technology, and the world of the arts is no different. And I'm looking forward to what could be unleashed in an optimistic way when we all have access to creative tools. I do think if you are more naturally endowed with artistic skill, you could use an AI system much better than somebody who can't paint or make music. So I don't think it's that artists go away, they can adopt these tools for themselves. But I think that there will be some magic to happen when we all have access to these systems to help bring different types of content or creative expression to life.
Is that the optimism that you were talking about, that one day possibly we would all have access to these tools?
Yeah, I think that would be the goal, that we could all kind of have access to them. I think, of course, there are risks that come, again, with everybody having access to these types of tools. But I do think it could be quite a great turning point for society if we use them and adopt them correctly, and we're informed in how to utilize them.
Well, there's been more effort on AI regulation in recent years. The AI Act in Europe, those potentially concerned about chatbots being used in class assignments, et cetera. What are your thoughts on regulation and reaction to emerging tech?
So there is when it comes to ChatGPT and the recent chatbots, some schools have leaned to just ban it outright. And I think the
schools might ban it, but the kids will find a way to use it.
The kids are going to use it anyways. And I think we're moving in the wrong direction, because the purpose of education is to prepare students for the economy of tomorrow. And that economy is going to be largely underscored by technologies such as ChatGPT and other AI systems. So we really do need to be equipping kids with not even just the skills to utilize these tools so they can actually be productive people in the economy, but to utilize them safely, right? So when we have conversations around misinformation and disinformation and the risks these systems present, if we're just banning them, we're banning an opportunity for the next generation to adopt these tools wisely and steer their future in a direction that they want to use it, or for it to go, sorry. And I think most of our current education systems are largely transitioning or encouraging kids for jobs of the past, not transitioning into the jobs of the future. And that means we've got to adopt these technologies, we've got to lean into them, and we have to also equip students with the skills to build them as well.
And at the beginning of the pandemic, work for a lot of people changed. A lot of people, if you were able to work from home, kids were learning online, as I mentioned. What would you say are the upsides to the future of work?
Right, so I think the pandemic showed us who were we incorrectly excluding from the workforce because we falsely assumed that everybody had to show up 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That opened up a whole new door for new parents or people with different mobility needs. So that was a kind of key shining light. I think the future of work is going to be a lot more flexible. So we've already been moving away from the days where you work for a single company for 10 years, and that trend is going to continue. The pandemic and technology showed us that flexibility can work, and it kind of prepared us for what more remote and more transient kind of workplaces look like. And I think that is something that's optimistic and helpful.
Well, from your view, I think for employees, it works to have a little bit of leverage now. But from the perspective of the employers, how are they taking that future of work? Are they adjusting well? Or are they going to fight it maybe?
I guess it kind of depends on the company. And I think we are adjusting well as employees, but I think we don't even fully realize what's coming. So when I say more remote work, or what I'm really referring to is in a world where smart machines learn new tricks over time, it becomes much less likely that a company is going to hire for a full-time role if that role is going to be radically changed in the next year or 2 years. So we're going to see a rise of the gig economy across all jobs. So we see a lot of, whether you're a delivery, driver or whatnot, we'll see it across financial analysts, lawyers, physicians, teachers, where we all work in kind of different roles for a few different companies at any one time. And in terms of are we embracing that, are companies embracing that, I don't think we're ready yet. But I think things like remote work have been helpful in kind of laying the foundation for how those systems and infrastructures could operate.
A couple of years ago, you wrote how we need to stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up. What did you mean by that?
And I know that question is usually asked with the best intention. But the reality is most of the jobs that a child would see today or answer that question with probably won't exist by the time they are in a working age, or they'll be radically transformed. So instead of kind of setting people up, and it's not for failure, but for the idea that your identity is attached to the job that you do, when we know the future of work is going to be very different, we should be encouraging kids to think more broadly about the problems that they want to solve, because those are more likely to exist than a specific occupation. And especially as technology continues to more rapidly disrupt the workforce, we have to move away from this idea that you are your job, because that's going to change. So if we can start with kids and encouraging them, what are the skills that you want to learn and the problems that you want to solve? And one of the most important skills for the future being critical thinking and imagination. That's something that children are already naturally endowed with. Lean into that.
The curiosity. When you said that, I kind of felt like, oh, I think that's hard for people to hear.
It is, but 15 years ago, the role of a social media manager or analyst didn't exist. Now, if a company doesn't have one, you're probably not going to make it. So the trend lines aren't very different. There are significant, whether you're a data analyst, a data scientist, all of these jobs have really come to the forefront in the last decade. And so that's still going to continue going forward. But I think the future always seems a lot more shocking from the present, and especially when we analyze it through the frameworks of the present.
How can we empower then people to embrace technology and to leverage it?
I think leaning into it, the best thing we can do about the future is prepare for it. It's not going to go away. To recognize how much you already use it. I don't know about you, I can't get down the street without consulting maybe Google Maps. So we use AI all of the time, social media, if you watch a streaming platform. So to know that these tools aren't as overwhelming as we might make them out to be. They're very actually easy to use, but it's about leaning into it, doing your best to try to understand it and keep up with the discourse with it. And then of course at a more societal and federal level, equipping people with the resources they're gonna need to thrive in such a dynamic future.
Sinead, it's been amazing having you here. I could talk to you for another hour.
Thank you so much.
Continued success to you.
Thank you. All the best.
And that is the agenda for Monday, June 12th, 2023. As mental health issues become more discussed and understood, some want to know, does depression have an evolutionary function? We'll explore that tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at TVO.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.